So welcome everyone to this session, which is an hour and a half of pure bliss to me on discussion devoted to primary sources. So first up is Nick Thieberger, Amanda Harris and Marco La Rosa on New Life for Digital Research.
Thanks so much for the invitation, for the introduction. I'm joining this session from Dharawal country, where it's currently lovely and rainy and all the flame trees are in bloom. And I want to pay respect to Dharawal elders past and present, and to extend that respect to any and all Indigenous people who are part of this session. This presentation has been prepared by Nick Thieberger, Marco and me, and Marco and I will be presenting it today. So what we're talking about today is the preservation of primary humanities research data that has been created in the course of research over the past generation. And we're thinking about a dedicated process to locate and secure such data, and to show how we have worked to do this with records of Indigenous languages and music in PARADISEC, the Pacific and Regional Archive for Digital Sources in Endangered Cultures, over the past 19 years. And a major focus of our work, especially in the beginning, was about locating analogue media that's at risk of loss. But the infrastructure that we've built is increasingly housing born digital material, which now represents about half of the 14,500 or so hours of audio recording in PARADISEC. And the current collection is around 140 terabytes of primary research material. Most of the recordings in our collection are of cultural performance, especially focused on the Pacific region, but also from elsewhere. And this is citable, curated material that is being safeguarded in the process from immediate loss, especially due to the fragility of that analogue tape media that I talked about before, but also of the digital objects. And that also enables then repatriation of those that research data to speaker communities for whom, of course, it's not research data, but is valuable cultural heritage. But there's always the concern there of long-term security of the collection. So I think we're all familiar with the problem with research data. That's a problem with all kinds of collections of files, that if a guide to a collection of media files or of images is lost, that the only way to figure out what's in them is to open them individually. Obviously something we want to avoid with thousands and thousands of files. But research projects often start without considering how the captured data will be curated and described so that it meets the FAIR principles of being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this is not only detrimental to the long-term curation of the content collected, but it also impacts the value of the data. Archives, of course, can help, but archives also are vulnerable to the problem of data and metadata being disconnected, which can leave us with the same problem we started with, of having to look at individual files to figure out what's in them. Our collection the PARADISEC collection has been storing metadata with the data collected in a custom XML format almost since the inception of the collection. And a key feature of the catalogue design is that the catalogue can be rebuilt from the data store. Primary records of research need to be preserved, firstly, in order to allow verification of the research claims. So we often have a publicly available analysis of the original research data, so that an individual researcher's take on that data has been published, but often the primary data itself is not publicly available. And so making it, looking after it in the long term and making it accessible allows verification of the claims made in any subsequent research publications. But it also allows further research to be conducted. Of course, the ideas that an individual researcher had on collecting the data may just be one use of that data, and there may be others that were unforeseen when that data was collected. But also, importantly, for our collection especially, but for many different kinds of research data, because of broader community interest in the materials, especially if the research is based on historical, cultural, or linguistic materials that are of value to the broader community in powerful ways. And finally, the other reason we want to be able to be doing this is that a lot of the research we do in universities is publicly funded, and so there's a reasonable expectation that primary records should be publicly accessible. Of course, with the possibility of restricting access. In our case, there's some cultural restrictions that mean that we want to be able to limit access to certain individuals as well. So in addition to the major task of locating and making records accessible, there's the technical aspect of how it can be done. And we're using OCFL, aaCrate, emerging standards using JSON that we'll talk about in more detail in a moment. So we're familiar with the problem of the disconnection between metadata and data, and on the screen now are images from our first two catalogues. One was a FileMaker Pro catalogue and subsequently MySQL database, where we learnt how easy it is to lose the connection between data and metadata. But currently, in our current system, items in the collection are stored in the format you can see there, where on disk are the item data files, the XML, the media files, and the images, as well as a special file named as the item, but with this suffix that the arrow is pointing to there, cat pdsc admin.xml. So this file contains all the metadata that's collected for that item in a custom XML format, and even the name of the file is descriptive, so that you might guess if you came across that it is catalog XML. In our collection, we have top-level collections, which might be, for example, all the recordings of a particular language at a particular moment in time by a particular individual. But then we also have sub-collections. So a sub-collection might be all the items related to a particular village, or recorded on a particular day, or something like that. And a benefit of using OCFL is that the sub-collections can be created as self-describing, so that they're not only dependent on that collection level description, but each item within that sub-collection is described by its own catalogue XML. This means that we can do things that are ways to think about repatriation of these records to speaker communities. And one of the things we've been working on recently is a delivery of archival files in these sub-collections, either via a hard drive or using what's in the image there, a Raspberry Pi computer, which can serve its own Wi-Fi, local Wi-Fi network, so that the files can be loaded up on a USB or hard drive and served to a small, for example, in a remote community, that Wi-Fi network can be created where users who might have phones but not computers can access the recordings on their phones. And storing the collection as aaCrate on an OCFL file system makes it possible to create these subcatalogues on the Raspberry Pi that haven't lost any of the rich metadata that describes them, but that make a sort of sub-collection of our much larger collection in Paradisec. Here's some happy snaps here of users in Vanuatu accessing some of their cultural heritage on mobile phones, where they can access the descriptive metadata, but also listen directly to the audio and view the images via a localized Wi-Fi hotspot. So the catalogue we currently have is still working well, but it's starting to show its age, and we have modularized some of the components, like the media viewing capability. I'll just show you a brief clip of that now. This is a viewer which shows you the audio file, but also the transcription, which can be followed along while listening.
nia bọc và lại phản đề luôn
nó chỉ lâu chả ba bu chả ba san chả thế chả bọc ba mua cả hạ nó ngã ba đông cơ ngã mà toàn dầu bắn toàn dầu đời là mà.
So this is one of the modules that is in our current catalogue, but the new way of doing things that we're looking at provides more opportunities for this to be developed, which we'll talk about. But we had to, because of the sort of growing size of our collection and the ageing system we're using, we had to think about new directions for the collection. And we were looking at some of the out-of-the-box systems like Archivomatica and Preservica, but found that no single system could meet our functionality requirements, and some development would always be required. And of course, with commercial systems, there's the problem of what happens to the data if the service can no longer be paid for at some point. So instead, we joined with another research group in adopting the Oxford Common File Layout, or OCFL, and building an open standards platform using the Research Object Crate and OCFL. So I'll hand over to Marco now to talk in more detail about how the technical side of this works.
Thanks, Amanda. So what we started doing a couple of years ago, as Amanda said, our current catalogue is reaching the limits of its capability. We have something like 140 terabytes of data on disk at the moment, and it's growing by something like a terabyte a month, I think it is, or maybe even a bit more than that. And when you have that amount of data, and certainly when you have more than that, you have an issue in monolithic systems where whether or not it's actually going to perform at that sort of scale. And our system is starting to show some of those issues now. So what we decided a couple of years ago was to say, well, how can we modularize this into smaller pieces that work well independently of each other? And we started looking around, and we came across this community specification called the Research Object Crate. And what this is it's an open spec that allows you to describe your metadata in a certain way using JSON linked data and using schema.org annotations, and you store that metadata with the content on disk. So when we started looking into this, and we reached out to the community, and we worked with some people at UTS, they put us onto the Research Object Crate specification. They also put us onto the OCFL specification. Can we go to the next slide, please, Amanda? In the OCFL spec, this is another spec that describes how to lay out files on disk. And this gives you certain guarantees of consistency and robustness of your data. Like it requires you to create checksums of your data, so you can go along later on and check that everything's okay. And when we're investigating these two specs, what we found is that the combination of both of them actually allowed us to lay our data on disk in such a way that we could decouple the service on top from the data storage layer itself. Now that is an incredibly powerful abstraction, because as you know, technology evolves so quickly and it changes over time. You know, as Amanda showed, we had two different technologies in the past, and they've both become redundant and obsolete. We're on our third. But in each case, moving from one stack to the next stack required a complex data migration. Whereas what we're doing now is we're saying, let's actually focus on getting the data in a form where it's well described and laid out in a very specific way on disk, so that in a few years' time, when our technology layer above actually becomes obsolete, or it doesn't scale, or it needs new capabilities, we don't have to look at the data layer again. The data layer can just keep growing, and it will always be safe. So the combination of these two specifications allows us to actually create a data layer that will give us that capability. So in terms of what it looks like, on the next slide, we've got a couple of screenshots that show what JSON linked data looks like. On the left-hand image is just a snapshot of the metadata itself. And if you're going to take away anything from this, take away the fact that it's a graph of entities. So you define entities, things like data sets and people and places, and you define the relationships between those things. And that's how you capture the metadata about your data. So in our case, we might say that we have a video file, which is of a recording of certain people in this location at this time period. and the keywords that describe that video file would be A, B, and C, and this is a description of what that video file encodes. And because that metadata always stays with the actual data itself, we never end up with a situation where we lose the connectedness between the data and the metadata. So that's what that example on the left is actually showing, believe it or not. And the example on the right is what the OCFL inventory file looks like. And it's basically an inventory that says we have these files which have these names. They have a version associated with them, so we can version content going forward. They have a checksum on them, so we can check down the track and see that they're still there, that they're still in the form that we expect them to be, that we haven't lost, that the data hasn't been corrupted or degraded in any way. Next slide, please. So a couple of years ago, we started on with some small funding from the ARDC to build a demonstrator, which is at that URL, mod.paradisic.org.au. And at the time, we went to export the whole collection, which at the time was about 115 terabytes, into OCFL, and we actually ran out of space at the university. And we've been waiting for them to upgrade their system ever since. So at the moment, there isn't 115 terabytes, but we ran out of space at about 70 terabytes, and we didn't notice any degradation in the performance of the system. So if you get some time, go have a look at that demonstrator, and that'll give you an idea of what we're doing. From your perspective, it looks like just a web application that allows you to describe, to navigate the data set. You can search for certain things, but all of that is actually being driven by these data files, which are on disk. And what that means is if at any point this demonstrator goes down or becomes unavailable, it goes offline for any reason, the data is not affected. We can turn the demonstrator on at a later date and everything will keep working. And the key point, again, is that the data is safe. And that's really what we're most concerned about. So the demonstrator looks like on the next slide, please, Amanda. This is what you'll see when you get to the demonstrator. This screenshot is a couple of years old, so the number of items and collections has changed with what's in there at the moment. But it gives you an idea. You get an overview of what's actually contained in this system. I think the current is, I'll read you the current stats. 13 collections in the current iteration, 457 items, 107 contributors from one university. It gives you a little bit of an overview. You get some search capabilities in the top right. If you do know what collection or which item you're looking for, you can jump to those directly in the very top panel and on the right-hand side. If you don't know if you're not looking for a specific item and you just want to do a simple name or description or contributor search, you can just type some keywords in there and get that, see what results match. Or in this case, being a demonstrator, we've given some links to specific items that you can jump to that have had the data populated. And then on the bottom half of the screen, we see just a grid view, which shows the most recently updated items. So again, I will point out this is a demonstrator. There are bits and pieces that probably aren't filled in here yet. We did have more in it, but until we ran out of space, and then we were asked to delete some of our data. And luckily, this is not the production system yet, so we could do that. But what this allows you to do is to actually start getting a feel for what this OCFL and RO crate combination lets you do. So on the next slide is just a screenshot of the collection. I think this is NT1. And you can see that there's a section at the top, which is some metadata that's been described for this collection. And then down the bottom, there are some languages which have been annotated. And then underneath that, we have some tabs which give you links to the items that form part of this collection. And if you then go on, you can either click through to those items and see what they have, or if you go on to the next slide, you'll see just an example of one of the microservices that's showing some of the capability. So in this case, the image in the top left is showing you that there are some images that are part of this item. So it's giving you an image viewer. And this all happens dynamically. As soon as you load the item off the disk, this happens inside your browser. It inspects the metadata and then renders a view specific for the data that's been found. So in this case, we can see that it's found images. So it's showing you an image viewer. And the screenshot on the bottom right, it says, well, there are also audio files. So it gives you an audio player. And I think from memory on the next slide, I've gone too far in my version. there is a transcription viewer, which Amanda can play. So I'm not sure. So what happened there was Nick was recording himself doing a search inside the transcriptions that are inside the catalogue. And each of those results is actually a specific segment within each of the transcription files. And what the viewer allows you to do is to actually play that very specific segment. So if you're looking for a specific word in a given language, you can actually, instead of getting a listing of all the items that have data for that language and then having to go through every single one of the transcriptions, you can actually get to that word in the transcription files, in the items from the search view. And then on the bottom right is the advanced search capability, which is allows you to basically mix and match all of the metadata elements that have been described for all of the items in the catalogue. And again, I want to point out that this is all driven off that RO-Crate metadata file. So there is an indexing stage which produces the actual search index, but that comes from this data on disk. There are no special services enabled to support this. It's just a simple search service. So in the couple of years that we've been playing around with this technology and building more and more into it, some other people have started to notice. So we've actually been tapped on the shoulder to lead the European Open Science Cloud data description activities. So Paradisic, along with our collaborator Peter Sefton from formerly UTS, now the Language Data Commons, and he's also an editor of the RO-Crate spec. We've been putting together some tools that allow the European Open Science Cloud to support researchers describing all of their data in all of their storage systems. And this is really the next generation of petascale FAIR repositories. So in terms of who's using this, OCFL is getting more and more traction around the place. It's going to be the basis of the next version of Fedora, because previous repository applications have all found the same problem. At a certain size, things just don't work very well. And once you get to 50 or 100 terabytes, whereas OCFL has been proven to work at much, much bigger scales than that. And I think that's really the key points to take away. So what this allows us to do is we can guarantee that our data actually meets both the FAIR and the CARE principles. By describing it the way that we do, we can build services that make it findable and make it accessible. The data is already in an interoperable form, which means that it can actually be reused. And it satisfies the CARE principles in terms of you can now look to higher level usage of it, in terms of feeding back or going back to the example Amanda was talking about in terms of the Raspberry Pi, being able to pull out sub-collections out of the collection for the benefit of the source communities and bringing it back to the source communities and saying, looking to them for the authority to control the data, for responsibility of the data and, for the ethics around the data. So I think at this point, I'll hand back to Amanda. Is this the one where I give back to you, Amanda?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's sort of just continuing on the same thing. I think we're probably out of time, but for the, if we're not guaranteeing the longevity of the collection, then of course we're not meeting those FAIR principles if a collection is temporary rather than accessible in the long term. And this model of using the OCFL system provides a sustainable data format. That means data can be reconstituted in the future without the original service that created it, and enables the described data objects to be moved to another custodian or another repository at the completion of the project without needing that original service. So we're thinking about building endings into projects from the start, using these emerging standards of OCFL and RO-Crate to create research objects that bundle primary data and the contextual information, and then looking at a virtuous environment in which data and microservices can be shared as the kinds of use of each is explicitly licensed within their descriptions. And some of our funding has come from ANS, from the ARDC, and from the Australian Research Council. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Amanda and Marco. Thanks. Any questions before we go on to the second paper? Birgit.
I just tried to applaud, not to raise my hand. It's too early for me.
That's okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, if it's okay, we'll save questions till a bit later, have them together. So let's go to Birgit Lang and team on From Archival Find to Public Domain, Otto Rank's Homosexual Tendencies in Mythology and Literature. Birgit?
Great, thank you. I cannot start my video. It says I've been stopped by the host, but I'll try to share my screen. That's probably the more important thing, really. So, can everyone see that?
Yes.
I think it should be okay to start your video again.
I'm back now.
That you're presenting.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So this is a very different project from the presentation we just heard. It's very minute in its dimensions. It's still a lot of work. So my head off to the Paradisec team for doing such an awesome job on such a big data collection. What we are presenting here is the attempt to bring one manuscript that has been hidden in the archives in New York into an open access form so people can use it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the manuscript itself, and then others of the team are going to talk to various aspects of it. And because we're all located at the University of Melbourne, so that's the biggest commonality, but I'm obviously a humanities scholar, and a lot of there's the Mdap team involved as well. Brigid is the PhD student, and Nick Thieberger from Skip, who is not here today. He was the person in the room that we all think about, but isn't here. So Otto Rank is an early psychoanalyst. He's and I found his unpublished manuscript that is held in the rare book and manuscript library at Columbia University a couple of years back. The original title is, what has happened here? The original title is Über den Ausdruck homosexueller Neigungen in Mythos und Dichtung. So we do have here a German manuscript, which is in line with my field of expertise. I'm a professor in German studies. And you can see here Otto Rank as part of this dynamic team of young psychoanalysts. He's here at the left back, and the manuscript I'm talking about is one of three that he presented to Freud in 1906, and that gave him entry to the psychoanalytic circles, which was unusual for the time because he was not a physician. Usually psychoanalysts were physicians by training, so he made a rather good impression on Freud. What happened with these three manuscripts I have described very shortly. Basically, both the first and the second one have been published in German at various points and have also been translated into English at a much later point. The second one, the Incest Theme in Literature and Legend. And there is this third one that's unpublished, Über den Ausdruck homosexueller Neigungen in Mythos und Dichtung, the representation of homosexual tendencies in mythology and literature. There are various ways to translate this. And this would have been the follow-up volume to das Inzestmotiv in Dichtung und Sage, but it never came out. The reasons for that are unclear. The manuscript itself consists of about 90,000 words. It's unpublished, as I said, partly revised, which doesn't make our task any easier. And the original version is from 1906, and then there is a second version where Rank clearly started reworking the manuscript. But overall, there's a lot of words there in a relative good state of textual refinement, let's put it that way. The story of this text, or my story of this text, might be typical what happens sometimes to humanities scholars. You go somewhere, you find something unexpectedly, you try to kind of get it going, and then it's not quite working. I wanted to publish a bilingual critical edition on this text a couple of years ago because the audience for Rank's texts are both in English and in German. So there is this kind of tension there that the original is in German. And I couldn't find a print publisher to take this on, because it just would have been a really big project. And the project was then revived through COVID, really. I first got a digital internship at the university, and then Nick invited me to come into this project to apply for a collaboration with Mdap, and the Mdap team I'm going to speak to who they are and what they do in a second. So we're trying to kind of bring this text now into TEI to make it open access and for everyone. And the other thing, but this is at the moment a work in progress, also has to be said. So what we have is the images that I took in the archive in the 2014-15 that I did not take with a view of publishing them on the net, so they're all a bit wonky and warped because I did them with my mobile phone and just flicked through, as many historians do. We had to kind of, with the images, we had to do quite a lot of work. We had to kind of make them, obviously, get them into perspective. Robert quite literally will talk to that. We had to rename the files. We had to sort out the copyright, and thanks to Columbia University to being very supportive of this. With the text, we had obviously the transcriptions. We had to work out the various text versions and to work how to bring this into a TEI form. And the translation is something that is still ongoing. I'm doing that at the moment, and that will go on continuous. I think in a separate step probably. We do the transcription first. Here you can have an image of on the left you can see what I did in the archive and then what it looks like now that we have cleaned it up. In terms of edition, I think, Brigid, do you want to talk to these ones?
Yes, sure. Thanks. So because of the nature of the text, in that it's a draft, at some points quite a rough draft, the transcription that we ended up with had a lot of information. So we needed to make a lot of decisions about what we wanted to be represented in the transcription in the end. So this decision-making process became a lot clearer once we'd identified our priorities, and our key priority being producing a readable text, as we felt this would make this text more accessible. And this was also enabled by another priority, which was that we would have the transcription with the facsimile of the manuscript alongside. So which means that if a reader is particularly interested in a passage, they can then refer to the manuscript, see if something's been crossed out or something's been scribbled on the margins. So yeah, having readability as an overarching priority made these editorial decisions much easier, because we could always kind of orientate ourselves towards that each time we needed to make a decision. And we then kept track of all the decisions that we were making, so that, you know, we had a kind of a rule sheet so that we could refer to that should the same situation arise, to make sure that we remained consistent. And yeah, we decided it was easier for us to do so this is about the technical side, we decided it was easier for us to do the initial editing in Word, because we're just so much more familiar with it. It's myself and Birgit. And then convert to XML at a later point. And we're now editing the XML using Oxygen. And Mdap trained us in Git to manage the changes in the image files, and TEI Publisher will be used later on to bring together the text and the images. Next slide, please, Birgit. Thanks. So here's an example of how the text, like I was saying, how we have the text, the transcription presented alongside a facsimile of the manuscript. So the transcription on the left is quite clean. We've taken out things like words which are marked out and things in the margin, but you can quite easily look to the manuscript on the right-hand side and zoom in on any section that might be of interest. And the next slide, thanks, Birgit. And you also have the option of viewing just the facsimiles, so without the transcription, and flicking through that way.
And I guess we ran into a couple of structural complexities from the humanities side. Let's put, not from the technical side. From there were complexities there too, obviously. And I think I'll just mention that so that we can finish my part of the section as well. So first of all, we had to get the rights to publish the manuscript and also to work with the photos, and Columbia, the rare book library, manuscript library, were very helpful in that context. They also said they would have never put this online because it's a draft, it's in German. It's just way too marginal for them to put any funding toward. The other thing that is a structural complexity is that it's hosted not on a university server but outside, despite the project fully supported by UM staff, and maybe Daniel and the Mdap team can talk to that a little bit. And I think the other thing is that probably of relevance to a lot of humanities researchers who go into this is that there is a limited publication recognition for online editions because they're not going through a review process. And so I've been grappling with this quite considerably, and we have come up with various workaround scenarios, but this is an ongoing issue on how these things can be credited in the life of a humanities scholar in a way that is useful for your life at uni, not only for the life of the work that you're producing. I think that these are the kind of main things that I would like to raise. Shall I hand it over to? I'll just try to stop sharing. Here we go. And now hand over to the Mdap team who will speak now. We've done all the technical stuff gloriously.
Can you see the slides?
Good. Yeah.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. My name is Ed. I'm here with my colleagues, Rob and Daniel, and I'm going to briefly introduce Mdap, Melbourne Data Analytics Platform. We've been working on this collaboration with Birgit, Brigid, and Nick for the past 7 or 8 months. So just a few minutes just to talk about us. We are sort of a diverse team of doing research support, and the reason why we are diverse compared to usual research support teams in universities, it's because we are a team of academic specialists. This is internal Melbourne Uni way of saying that we are academics, but with slightly different KPIs compared to traditional academics. And we work to enable data-intensive research across all the disciplines, all the faculties in Melbourne Uni. There are 3 main pillars of what we do. Collaboration, as I said, because we are academics, we aim to collaborate as peers with external collaborators, and that's what we did for this particular collaboration, the Otto Rank one. And we bring to the table computational expertise, but because we're academics, we sort of are in between 2 worlds, the pure academic world and the service support world, Melbourne Uni. And so we bring to the table expertise in computational techniques, and we can speak the language of academics and research stuff. And the name of the game, of course, is research impact, trying to boost data intensive and digital research at Melbourne Uni. And this is a snapshot of our team. As of next week, we will be 22. And on the left, you can see sort of a cartoon, the way we see ourselves. We come from different academic domains. We have different backgrounds. I'm an astrophysicist, for example, but we have people coming from linguistics, fine arts, archaeology, and so on, engineering, medicine, and so on. And as I said, we bring to the table different computational expertise. I'm going to talk about this in a second. And also a key component of what we do is networking, talking to people, connecting people. So those organizational skills. This is a brief list of our expertise, and you find more information in our website if you're interested, but we go from all the way from research and study design, data management, data stewardship, all the way to more technical capabilities, let's say natural language processing, machine learning, data visualization, data analysis, and many more. Finally, in here is just another summary of the sort of things that we do. So research is the main component, research and research support. Advocacy within the university and also outside, we aim to bring the voice of academics and the needs of academics in doing research where these voices need to be listened and addressed, the concerns. Consultancy, we're always happy to talk to people, and it doesn't have to be Melbourne Uni people, so please feel free to get in touch anytime. And finally, as I said, networking is a main component of what we do, connecting people, trying to break down silos, changing culture where people do their own things in their own office. We try and go against that. I have a final slide with contacts, but I think there is another one later on, so I'm going to pass it to Daniel now.
Thanks, Ed. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes looking at some of the different tools that we're using and a bit of a map of how they fit together. So as mentioned before, this is a TI project. So the main sources that we've got are TI XML, which is the encoding for the main text. The TI files we have to actually transform into some sort of output. This could be HTML, it could be PDFs, it could be all sorts of things. Most of the work we're doing currently is for the web, but we do need a way to sort of translate the TI into an output, and that's where we have these files called One Document Does It All, which is a special TI specification that will translate the original TI text into one form of output or another. And of course, we also have the facsimiles that appear on the final output. For a lot of this work, we've tried to automate as much as we can just to keep the workflow and the sort of update cycle fairly quick. So we've been using GitLab for all of our automation. So it can hold our XML code, but we can also use the automation tools to push different resources to where they need to be. For the images, we've been using a server that runs the IIIF, so the International Image Interoperability Framework. So we can see up the top, it gives us different sorts of APIs that we can use for this kind of work. I think Rob will dig into some of those in a bit more detail. We've got an image API for getting different parts of images or rotating them, resizing them, and so on, a presentation API, etc. And for those interested, the technologies on the IIIF server are called Minio, which holds the files, and Cantaloupe, which serves up the images. We also use the TI Publisher API to send our XML files, so it's both the TI and this One Document Does It All, across to TI Publisher. And TI Publisher offers a whole lot of different features for working with TI, but we're most interested in the web components that it gives us. So it gives us an easy way to present the rendered TI on the screen. And then all of these different tools, eventually we're piping into Django. So Rob's going to speak a little bit about some specific tools that he's put together using Django and some other Python packages. So I'll hand over to Rob.
Thanks, Daniel. Hello, everyone. Work on this project required the development of some tools that we're going to release under an open source license. One was to change the perspective of the images. This app's called Corners, and the other was to display the transcription and the images on the web. So this is Django TI. As Birgit mentioned, the images weren't captured originally in a way with a view for their public dissemination. They were taken at an angle which distorted the perspective. This would have been fine for personal use, but since we're making a digital edition, we wanted to correct the distortion. So to adjust the perspective, we needed to build a transformation matrix for each image. And the easiest way to do that was to identify the 4 corners on the page, and then we can use OpenCV to create the transformation matrix. We tried some automated techniques to find the corners, but these weren't accurate enough, possibly because frequently at least one of the corners wasn't on the image itself and had to be extrapolated to estimate where it would be. So it seemed best just to simply annotate the location of the corners by hand. We wanted to have it in a reproducible way so that we could keep the original images, and the location of the corners would be stored as metadata so that we could generate the corrected images at any stage. So we made a tool called Corners that does this. You simply give it the list of images and it creates a file which stores the metadata. It's all displayed on a little web app. The user just drags the 4 corners, or the 4 nodes here in red, to the appropriate location of the image, and each image just takes 4 mouse movements, and then you progress to the next one. This allowed us to efficiently annotate the 400 images of the manuscript, or almost 400. The program's written in Python and uses Flask for the web app, and the interactive elements written in HTML and JavaScript. There's an example of the transformed image. The second program is for displaying TI and IIIF documents online using Django. We're using a content management system called Django CMS, and we've made a little app for this called Django TEI. TI, as Daniel said, is a terrific tool for displaying and working with TI documents on the web. And if you're happy to display the documents inside the TI publisher interface, then that's all you'll need. But if you want to use it in another web application, you need to do some extra work. So the good thing about TI Publisher is that it has a layered architecture, which allows you to reuse the web components on other places on the web. So we made use of this functionality and made it available in the content management system, it's a bit like WordPress or Squarespace. The user can just add components to the website dynamically. So the user just clicks on the plus button, you can tell it where the TI Publisher instance is, what the file name is, and it'll display the document on the web page. We also did the same with the AAAF. We made a plugin for adding AAAF easily into the content management system, so you can give it the AAAF server and then the file name, and it'll show the AAAF image using OpenSeaDragon, or you can give it a AAAF presentation, which is like a collection of images. You just give it a link to the manifest and it'll display it using an app called Mirador 3. So we hope these tools will be able to be used by others working in similar projects. That's it from me. So I'll hand over
I think that's
to
the end.
Birgit. So that's all of us. So thank you very much. Stop sharing.
I think you were very efficient.
Thanks very much, guys. We've got a bit of time for comments on both of those two papers, if anyone's got some. In the chat, or just unmute yourself. And go for it. I had myself maybe an obvious observation, but one which excites me. Both of those projects are, of course, looking at publishing and making available things with lots and lots of different modes: graphics, video, text, all in one place, and try to make it accessible to people. It's much harder than it looks. Marco.
Hi, thanks. I'll start by disclosing that I'm the technical person on NIAN, so I work with Nick. And this is for the Mdap folks. You've gone through a whole host of different technologies, and I've been pointed at all of those exact same technologies. The thing that has concerned me with those technologies, they seem to be independent stacks, and you've put them together you've managed to get them to work together. When I looked at them, I thought it was going to be horribly complex to do that, but you've made it look trivial. Was it as trivial as it seems?
Yeah, I think the key thing is that they do what they're supposed to do quite well. Yeah. It's useful to have these sort of microservices that can work on their own. Like the AAAF server, we can use it for this TI project, but there's a good chance that we'll use it for a lot of other projects as well. So, I mean, this is only work that we've done in the last few months. We don't know for sure, whether it's the best way forward for all of these additions. But because the different services have quite sort of clean APIs, and we can use the GitLab to sort of automate moving things from one place to another, it's worked quite well so far. And I think maybe Birgit and Brigid can sort of say if it's been easy enough to work with.
Well, I was going to ask that as the next part of the question. From a user perspective, do they need to be experts in each of those independent pieces, or do you give them like one endpoint and say, put your data here, and then a whole bunch of magic will happen and it will appear in all these different places and various transformations will occur? I mean, how does it look from a user's perspective?
Lots of magic happening. And I think would be pretty, I don't know how we would do it without the Mdap people, to be honest.
I mean, the main entry point is sort of Git for the XML, and sort of all of the automation happens from there. But it does vary. I mean, we do have to sort of factor in the usability. If we're working with different groups, then maybe we'd use a different architecture. But in this case, having a single entry point was a priority.
Thank you.
I didn't find Mirador, when I had a little experiment, very easy to get to work. One of the image viewers.
You said you found it easy or it wasn't easy?
No, not very. Maybe
Okay.
amateurish.
No, that's right. It can be a little bit fiddly, but that was one of the reasons why I wanted to make the plugin for the content management system. So you wouldn't have to know how to add it into a website yourself. You could just add it the same way as you'd add a text box onto the website by doing it, although you don't need to know any of the background. So that's hopefully what that plugin will help with.
Right, that's good. We still got a few minutes. I'm dying to ask on the humanities side, Birgit, you said you decided on modern German spelling. I think the rules changed or were regularized in about 1990. So that was probably a big decision, really, was it?
It was a really big decision because I think I'm a philologist by training. So the way I first approached this when I transcribed it was to kind of note down every really small change, everything that had been struck through. And then we started working with Mdap and thinking about what we wanted with this project. And I thought, like, well, it's a fairly niche text, right? And I want to create its biggest audience that I can get it, which means it will need to be in German, it will need to be in English, because it's a draft that's at points very consistent, but at points not so consistent. I thought it has to be in good nick in terms of readability. And I think we had long discussions with Brigid, and I had long discussions about this, but I think once I made that decision not to kind of do a traditionally philological kind of edition like you would do with a medieval text where you don't have 100,000 words, right? Then I think things fell into place much more. But it took a long time because my first edition is on top of everything else, a long time to kind of think through these things, to kind of actually understand what it is we're grappling with. Once we had made this decision, it made, I think, everything much easier. Yeah. And we were also, I think that I also agree with there's lots of magic happening. And I think one thing we were always very consistent about noting down the rules that we applied so that we would have consistency across such a big volume of text. And I think that has served us very well as well.
Did I understand correctly, looking at some of your screen dumps, that in the where the manuscript has a crossing out or something written above, that you've not represented that per se in the transcript because you've got the manuscript alongside?
Yeah.
That is interesting. That is really relying on the user to do some intellectual work, which I approve of, and sometimes
thank you.
Yeah. And I guess the same thing can be said with changing the spelling as well. Like if someone is that interested, the manuscript's right there and they can look at the original spelling.
Exactly, yeah.
And there is not the handwriting is relatively eligible for a text of that time. I think that is that decision too, that I think people can actually do it. It's like with someone who would have been trained 20 years earlier in school, you couldn't actually make that decision because for most people, they couldn't read it. So it would become very niche. But we tried out the kind of a really philological version of this, and it just became really clunky and very work intensive too. And I think that's the other thing is this, because I'm new to this, so there is I have lots of insecurities to deal with. One is the methodological insecurity that I have with all the technology, and I have a great team to look after that, but I still have to curtail my own anxiety in that space. But I also kind of have to make all these other decisions, and so it was a really interesting process, and it was quite wonderful to work as a team to kind of just see how that very different perspective on a text, and how to bring it out into the world.
Well, it's looking really good.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Marco?
Well, this sort of follows on from what Amanda and I were talking about, and I'm sure Nick has been talking about this, but I'll ask the question anyway. Given Birgit's comment a moment ago about technology risks and what happens with the data, what is your exit strategy? Because you've now got data in all these different services. What happens when the Mdap project wraps up and maybe priorities change or something happens? How do you deal with the data that you've got in these different places from that point forward?
I'll hand it over to the Mdap team.
Yeah, I mean the XML is mostly sort of self-describing, and we do have that version and this is persistent. But there could certainly be, another tranche of work around sort of more advanced metadata description of the kind you were discussing. Now, for this particular project, we only had a few months, at a fraction of FTE, so we're really focused on getting the TI working. Yeah, but you're right, there's always more that you can do in that regard.
Thank you.
Can I just quickly add that because of the way that we work, at the formal end of the collaboration does not mean that Mdap will disappear, and does not mean that Birgit and Brigid and Nick cannot reach out at any time in the future. So Mdap has been established with a long-term vision, and also because we are academics, we want to be there when it's time to, publish the results and because we have those KPIs too. We have to, to progress ourselves and to show that we are useful. So formal ending of the collaboration, it doesn't mean that we're going to disappear, just to put it simply. And then there is also a component of upskilling. So Birgit and Brigid now, they are proficient with GitLab, and there's always, we're always here to progress that from the technical point of view, if they want to improve their knowledge on other aspects, or all the aspects, technical aspects that we discussed during the presentation.
Oh, sure, but what happens in the case, for example, that if Mdap is going to continue, we know that, and you look at the services, you've got a IIIF server, you've got TI publisher service, and you've got other bits and pieces, and say at some point next year, you have a look at your technology stack across Mdap and say, we've only got one customer on the TI service, we can't continue to support that, but that's a key piece of this work, but you don't have the resources to support the TI component, so you decide as a group that we have to shut that down. What happens in that instance? So even though Mdap has continued, the collaboration can still actually continue, but Mdap just doesn't have the resources to support all the independent technology pieces.
Well, there is a whole range of platforms and services at the university. And as I said, we are here also to connect Birgit, Brigid, and all the other researchers out there to the right service, to the right support at the university. It's unlikely that what you're describing is going to happen. And if it does, for some of the researchers, we are here to rectify. Mdap has been, created to rectify those problems. As I said, if we see that there is a need, we want to help people.
I might add something else as well. With the infrastructure side of things, we do sort of try to take an infrastructure as code approach. So all of the servers, I think I forgot to mention at the end of my presentation, but we're using Docker for a lot of the services that we're running. So we can easily, if we need to spin that up somewhere else, or spin it down or do whatever, move it to a different service, move it to AWS, whatever we need to do, we can do that relatively easily with a fairly modest time investment.
That's great.
We do think about these things, but who knows?
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. That's really good.
We can do.
That's great. Thanks very much, guys. Our next paper is on exactly this, perhaps this idea of endings and persistence and so on. It's from Tully Barnett. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. Tully.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen, which I thought for a minute wasn't going to work, but now it looks like it is. Just let me know that that is all good. I'm just going to assume that it is. Thanks, everybody. Ninamani. I'll begin by acknowledging that I live and work on the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I acknowledge and pay respects to the Indigenous custodians of all the lands upon which our conference attendees call in from to this wonderful conference. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, and I'm used to presenting for digital humanities conferences on my digitisation research. But the other hat that I wear is around cultural policy and cultural value. And for this presentation, I'm joining the two together, which is a little bit new for me. And so, yeah, please forgive me if that's a little bit rattly. It was in that crossover space between culture and digital humanities in the form of the Amaga conference, the Museums and Galleries conference, that Nick Thieberger and I started having these conversations about value and digital objects and digital platforms. Where's Nick? He's been referred to many times today, especially in this session, but he's somewhere like this right now, out enjoying the bioculture of Australia's great heritage, and not here to do his part of the talk that was always going to be a conversation, a dialogue between us. However, we're very lucky that this paper has been programmed into this session because you have all heard a lot about Nick's side of things. So in addition to Paradisec that Nick works with, there are a lot of really important Australian and Australasian and international cultural heritage, digital cultural heritage projects, digital infrastructure projects, digital humanities projects that we get to benefit from all of the time. And the two that I'm personally most familiar with are aaDH, which is hosted at my university, Flinders University in South Australia, but also AusLit, the Australian Literature Resource or Gateway, which is a project that I used to work on when I was a postgrad. And so that colours my thinking about some of the problems that we share in this space, and of course Nick's familiarity not only with Paradisec but with all of the other projects that he works on there. But they all have one common problem. How do we talk about and how do we evidence the value of these long-term digital humanities projects? And we've got some problems. So I come to this with that other hat that I was talking about, the Cultural Policy, Cultural Value Project, with a project that has a problematic name for whenever I'm presenting in front of digital humanities people, because we called it Laboratory Adelaide, the value of culture. We called it Laboratory Adelaide because we thought that Adelaide, as not too big a city like Sydney or Melbourne, had one of everything in its cultural landscape, and we could observe the interactions of value in a local cultural environment of just the right size. So that's why we called it Laboratory Adelaide. Maybe not the greatest idea, but we've been working towards this for a few years, and that's a picture of our book there, What Matters, Talking Value in Australian Culture, co-authored with Julian Merrick and Robert Fidian. And so when I talk to cultural organisations about their value, and this will become, how this is relevant will become apparent, I believe. When I talk to cultural organisations about the problem of value, I like to take it away from arts and culture for a minute and ask the question, as Dave Beer does, how much are the oceans worth? And I get people to stop and think about it for a second, think about that question, how much are the oceans worth? And I suggest that maybe they're going to think about how, you know, the time that they spent in their childhoods, with their families, in a coastal beach house, or building sandcastles, or picking up rocks in the oceans, or maybe they're thinking about tourism at the Great Barrier Reef and what that contributes to Australia. Maybe they're thinking about small communities in the Pacific Rim and what fishing relates to for them, for their communities. But really, how much of the ocean's worth is such a bizarre question. And why am I not moving forward? And, you know, Dave Beer in his book Metric Power says not only is it an odd and even pointless question, but it's also, and the answer is also an incomprehensible abstraction, because there, people do generate this idea of how much are the oceans worth, and the answer that someone came up with in 2015 was $24 trillion, right? So $24 trillion is such a big number and an abstracted concept that is it something that we can really work with when we're thinking about how value operates in this way? And then what happens, I ask, if next year the oceans are only worth $23 trillion? The people that say, let's put a value on the oceans, they do it because they think if we know how much it's worth, then we will look after it more, or it will feature more heavily in our decision making around what to do with and for oceans. But what if next year it's only worth $20 trillion because environmental degradation has actually reduced its value? Or what if we find out that the forests are actually worth $40 trillion? So are we now comparing the oceans and the forests, and we have to choose one, rank them perhaps for our environmental action in order to protect these things? Right, so in our project Laboratory Adelaide, we started with this idea that cultural organisations are required to express their value through aggregate gauges such as ticket sales, hotel beds sold, spillover economic effects, or the values of their collections, etc. But they can't report what is truly meaningful for them. Why they're doing what they're doing, who they're really impacting, that one person that they reach through this cultural project. And economic impact studies do not tell the full story of the value of an arts experience or organisation or event, or an artist and an artist's career. And unfortunately, we have no useful means of talking about other kinds of value. So there's a gap between evidence and action, right? So the numbers that we generate also don't always work. So those economic impact statements develop a lot of evidence, but they don't always lead to action. There's something else that's going on in that mix, and some of those things that's going on in the gap between evidence and action are the problem of time. Arts and culture and digital humanities projects operate along a time scale that's different to an annual report, a 1-year LEAF grant, a 3-year grant, or even a 5-year strategic planning window. So the concept of longitudinal value has to be accounted for here. There's a problem between history and memory versus innovations. History, memory, and maintenance versus innovation. We're addicted to the new in our culture and in our funding mechanisms. And so we have to think about how that is influencing the way that we look after the things that are really important to us. We've got a problem with narrative, which is that we think, especially in the humanities, that narrative is our bread and butter, and that we're able to really communicate value through our words. But that's not necessarily true. We have to think a little bit better about how narrative works for communicating value, and we have to think about how it's received at the other end. So that's a future project for me. So this gap, this tension between innovation and maintenance is something that a lot of people are talking about at the moment. And I refer you to the ION article called "Hey, or the Maintainers," and the group, the maintainers, who are keeping technology working. So thanks to people who are keeping Paradisec working, Offstage working, Oslit working, and all those other amazing projects that we benefit from as a way of understanding who we are. So innovation versus maintenance. If you look at the wording of our grant schemes, they're always talking about what's innovative here, what's new. And so where is support for maintenance going to be coming from? That's a problem that we have. And numbers don't really demonstrate value anyway, right? So we're addicted to growth in arts and culture. So I often tell the story of the one festival that couldn't report on a growth number in terms of ticket sales, artists at the festival, numbers, contribution to GDP, whatever. So they told a story about most pies sold, PIES, edible pies, because that was the growth number that they could point to, right? So there's a kind of a nuclear proliferation going on where you have to report on bigger and better numbers than ever before. what happens in culture when you get a bad number? Receivers of evidence of value that's in numerical form tend to think that numbers are neutral, but we know that isn't true, right? They are heavily subjective. We think that, we have to understand that all data is political, all evaluation is political, and there's this kind of methodological churn that happens, right? Where whoever is the first person to try a new methodology that proves a new form of value may have success with it. So a library might value their products just as we value the ocean in terms of adding up the replacement value of all of the things that they have. But that's not going to work if every cultural organisation or if every digital humanities project values in that way, because it's the first cabs off the rank for a new form of value that get the success, right? And so then there's a tension between value and values that I think are a problem here, but I'm going to skip along that, but we can come back to it if anybody's interested. So what are some ways that we're thinking about how value might work in digital projects? So there's forms of value. When I started my project with Laboratory Adelaide, I went out and did surveys that use these kinds of use and non-use values that asked people coming out of events what was the benefit of that, right? But we asked it in this way that was about money. It was about how much did you spend on the entire experience at this arts and cultural event, and how much would you have been willing to spend and still feel that you got value for money? And then you multiply the gap between those two numbers by the attendees, and that's one way of coming up with something like cultural value. But they don't even believe that when you report on those numbers, even when they're huge. So forms of value: direct use, indirect use, option value. So that is, I'm not using it right now, but I might want to use it in the future. Bequest value, that's I want to leave it for the future to be able to benefit from. Or existence value, I have no use for this whatsoever, but it's really just important that it exists. But there are people that are doing this in relation to digital resources. So Simon Tanner is one of those at King's College London. He, in 2012, I think, was the first one. He came up with something that he calls the balanced value impact model. And so that here in the 2021 article, which is a screen capture from the right, on the right of the screen, he puts that into a bit of a methodology with a set of stages that gives us a step way through that. And we can see that here that there are different kinds of forms of value there that get taken up into this a methodology for understanding the value, how we might value digital objects. There's another method around thinking about what is the cost of inaction. And again, I think this really can work for some people. So for example, if you've got a valuable collection that is being stored in inappropriate environment, letting people know what is the cost of not fixing the air conditioning for that space, for example, not fixing the leaky roof. That has had a lot of success in getting funding for that maintenance work. But how does that translate to the digital space, right? There's a series of complications there when we think that you can't see the leaky roof, right? You can't take the relevant minister or funder or philanthropist to that store facility, show the leaky roof, show the beautiful picture that is a painting that is vulnerable in that space. So but the ephemerality of digital adds a complication to communicating that inaction here, I think. So I just want to conclude by thinking about so some issues around value, right? So value comes in all sorts of forms. Value is both tangible and intangible. Value is accrued over short, medium, and long term. So I talked about longitudinal value, but yes, some value has that payoff in that first year. It's that kind of almost instantaneous moment. Value cannot be reduced to a number. but aspects of it can sometimes be expressed in quantitative terms. So I'm not suggesting that we never use dollar figures or other forms of numbers in order to communicate value, but that we have to figure out how to balance that within narratives, within stories, within other ways of talking about value. And arts and culture contribute to well-being, social cohesion, understanding ourselves and our world, and happiness. But we need to think about that in a way that's not going to lead to this valuing of this digital cultural heritage work or this digital project work in a way that can just be the first thing that's excised when there's an austerity moment. It has to form part of arts and culture, and digital cultural projects need to be understood as part of a foundational need, as a basic service, as part of being in a society. And so if we think about some different ways that we might approach that, and then apply them to projects like Paradisec, projects like AusLit and AusStage, then we've got some thinking about how we might do that. So for Simon Tanner's project, valuation methods, he talks about utility value, existence value, or prestige value. So those are the same kind of terms that come from the longer period of literature about how we understand value. But to this, he adds specifically education value, community value, and then goes back to those older methods like inheritance value and bequest value, in order to think more robustly or more fully about how value works for arts and culture and for digital heritage projects. So, that's things like time that's lost if data is not archived, the loss of research investment in primary records, eventual backlash from taxpayers who see loss of research data as wasteful of government funds, loss of heritage as records are lost and become unusable, time lost in finding research material if it still exists, time lost in recreating research data if it has been lost, the effort and cost of digitising a collection for a single research project. If appropriate standards for the creation of the records are followed, then the outputs can be archived and then become part of the national estate, ready to be used for future work or accessed by a broader public. There's thinking to be done here around standards, how material archives are similar but different, how this might speak to reviewers of funding applications who want to see that effort is put into maintenance and things like that. But effort to establish costs is hard enough, and how to establish the value of looking after these projects is more difficult still. But that is the challenge that we are having to face in this moment. And so that's where Nick and my conversation is up to. Thanks.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Tully. You've stunned me with 1,000 ideas and made me almost answered all the hundreds of questions I've always had in my mind instinctively. There are lots of hands up, or are they just claps?
They are claps, yeah.
I really love it. Just interrupt me if you want to. The narrative, we don't know how to use it even though we do it. That's a stimulating thought. And
yes, I think that's a challenge, yeah. So I think that we work with words all the time and we communicate in everything that we do, but narratives of value communicate differently and they land differently. And so I think there's a need for a little piece of research around that, around the reception essentially of narratives, reports of value, evidence of value, data sets of value, and what happens to them in the world, and what kinds of readers make different kinds of meaning. So, one of my dreams in my cultural value project for a long time has been to take a report, like a project report. So, for example, an annual report of a cultural institution or a report from a end of project by an individual artist, an ARC report, and to tag it so that when it goes off in the world and is read, we get information back about how it is read. even then, we've got a problem of the black box of reading, which is that we can't see reading and meaning making. We can see eye scans. So wouldn't it be interesting to see what parts of a report get read? Who's reading the budget report, right? The financial statement? Who's reading the evidence of value, you know, the statements, the testimonials of impact or of benefit? Who's reading the artist's voice in the instances that I'm thinking of in my other project? Who's reading the researcher's voice when the researcher writes what meaning has been made out of this project? I sometimes joke that I know what will happen with it. You know, with a artist's report or a cultural institution's report, you know, the numbers go in one direction and the narrative goes in another direction, probably the bin. So, I think that would tell us something. So I'm going to figure out how to, fund that little project. And the closest I can get to it actually is just talk to receivers of reports and see if they will be honest in telling me how they read reports.
This is fascinating. Just unmute yourself and interrupt if you want to contribute. There's a thing I'm a little bit obsessed with myself, catalogues. They've existed way before we were fancy digitized, because they were card catalogues, and I remember myself seeing them in the National Library, and they kept them sort of out of sentiment, the big boxes. And now they're online. They've got stuff in them, but people tend, without, I suspect, thinking that no one values them. So is this something you can articulate, this assumption that there's something is produced, but there's no value, and people determined to say it has no value, but in fact it does have value if only you asked, as you said, the receivers. Catalogues, I think, is one of those things.
Yeah, I think you're right. You're right. And one of the things, one of the main forms of value for cultural institutions is bums on seats, right? User data. And when we started this cultural value project, the number of website hits was not even allowed to be used as evidence of value for the State Library of South Australia. It was only people through the door as was the only form of evidence of value in terms of user, and requests at the desk, books called up from the storage facility, things like that. But website hits, even in 2013, 2014, was not seen as evidence of usage because, of the value of the State Library. And so I think that that shows that and then the head of the State Library would then tell me that every year, the forms of value that they'll accept get narrower and narrower and further away from, that core mission statement of that library. So I think, you're right to point to the fact that, there's problems with segmenting, to use the parlance, those communities, and assuming things about who uses what and how and for what purpose.
I just think that's odd. I'm just stunned and surprised. Really, all those things are evidence of people valuing the State Library of South Australia, for instance. Yeah. The other thing was existence value. And I thought that's another thing that you've just clicked with me. That's what I've always wanted to say when I've tempted to do, or invited to do some sort of online, survey, and I always refuse, because I know that I can't express what I value about, I'm sitting in Canberra, the National Library. I bloody value the fact that it's there. Am I allowed to say that or not? So I'm glad you're finding a way to.
Yeah, but you need to articulate, you need to separate out why you're glad that it's there. Because if you're glad that it's there because you might want to use it, that's option value. And so what was really interesting in some of the data that we did, so I talked about how I had to go out and survey people about, how much they valued some of these cultural things. And that led to some pretty problematic spaces. For example, I had to stand outside of an Archie Roach concert with a tablet with a survey on it and a team of surveyors that I had trained how to use this methodology, and ask people coming out of this Archie Roach concert with tears streaming down their face. They'd just heard, you know, the experience of the stolen generation from the mouth of Australia's best storyteller. And I had to say, now, if you had to summarize how much that meant to you, or even worse, how much did you pay to come out tonight, including your babysitter, your travel, your parking, your food, and then how much would you be willing to pay and still feel that you got value for money, right? I had to ask this question, and then I just said, right, we're out of here. We're not going to, because to do that intervenes in the value. It stops it, right? So, but what we did get, what was better from that process was not the use value, but the non-use value, which is we were asking people coming out of a car race that for many years was held in Adelaide at exactly the same time as the Fringe and Festival in March, the Clipsal. People would be coming out of that, and the first question is, you know, have you been to the Adelaide Festival this year? No. Have you been to the Adelaide Festival ever? And people would answer no. And then we get the non-user survey pops up on these tablets. And we would ask them, you know, what's good about it, right? And they would rattle off all of these things. They've got no intention of, it's not bequest value. Sometimes they would talk about, sometimes they would talk about bequest value, which is for their children. They're not valuing it for option value, which is for themselves to use in the future. But it was mostly about existence value, which is that it's just a good thing that's good for the state. It's good for our reputation. I don't care about it, these people would say, but I would be happy for some of my tax money to go to that, you know?
This is about citizenship, which unfortunately our current politics just doesn't allow for.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So, but our challenge now is to think about how these concepts relate specifically to digital projects and acknowledging that the digital things that, you know, is different. And so, like I said, Simon Tanner's done a bit of that work for us, but I think there's still a way to go in order to be able to talk convincingly about the value of these projects in a way that's not a trap, in a way that's not competitive between these projects, right? There was a narrative for a while that the ARC was funding AusLit and AusStage in alternate years, right? It wasn't prepared to fund both. So it's your go now, it's your go now. And that led to, you know, problematic austerity for those projects. So in competition with each other. So, so like I said, there's methodological churn, and the first person that uses the methodology tends to have the best success with it. But now we have to think about how we're going to make that argument as at the digital cultural work as foundational to Australian and other nationalities' core business.
Within professional IT, this is going back a couple of decades for me, you've got another phrase, methodological churn, which again represents, I used to be irritated. I didn't have a good word for it, but it was definitely evident. And also your earlier point about maintenance versus development, that was very much around in 1990s. IT, again, it annoyed the hell out of me. We had to do it. You were higher status if you were a developer than if you were on the maintenance team. We sort of knew that was wrong and silly, but we didn't know how to combat it in words. I'm being warned by our marvellous administrators that our session is about to close, but thank you very much for an extremely stimulating three presentations from all of you, large teams, collaboratively. Thanks very much.